Okay, guys, why don't you guys make your way in and grab your seats? We're going to get started so we can get Dr. Kaldjian up here, our distinguished speaker for the evening. I noticed some unfamiliar places in here, and Jeff and I were talking with Dr. Kaldjian a few minutes ago, and we just realized that this event has been advertised a little bit more broadly than we initially thought, and that's great. So welcome. If you're a visitor to Veritas Church, we want to welcome you. My name is Brian Durbin. I'm one of the pastors here, and kind of the reason I'm part of hosting tonight is because one of my roles at Veritas is to help teach in our Veritas School of Theology. And so one thing I'd love to do is give a shameless plug for our Veritas School of Theology. So if you're in the ethics class that we're doing right now, or you've just taken any classes in VST, why don't you just stand up real quick? I know it's embarrassing for some. So if you're not standing, take a look at these people, take note of them, because we're opening applications for VST. You guys can go ahead and sit down. Talk to those people that have taken VST if you haven't taken it already. I guarantee you they will tell you that it's worth it and not a single one of them regret taking it. It's well worth your time. We're called, as disciples of Christ, not just to grow in discipleship ourselves, but equip ourselves to go and make disciples. And Veritas School of Theology is a great way to do that. So our full year program is getting ready to kick off here. Applications are due March 1st. Classes begin in May. And so if you're interested in that, stop by Info Central, track down Alyssa, or talk to one of those people that were standing. But like I said, our most recent classes, we ran this Christian ethics class this winter and spring. This is actually our last week of the class. And we had a little over 20 students in there, and it was a very engaging class. I mean, we covered some very personal topics. That's the way ethics is, right? That's the nature of this topic. We covered sexuality, marriage and divorce, homosexuality, transgenderism, beginning of life ethics, end of life ethics, race relations, and ministerial ethics as well. And so it was a very engaging class. And as we were getting ready to kick off that class, Jeff and I started talking, and we thought, could we get creative with this class? Because Jeff had developed a relationship with this guy that I knew very little about, Dr. Kaldjian, and we knew he was not just a brilliant man, but he had a thriving relationship with Christ. And that doesn't happen as often as we might like in the field of ethics, and especially in the field of medical ethics. So we grabbed coffee with Dr. Kaldjian, just talked about the prospect of him coming here to talk tonight, and it worked out. And so a little bit about Dr. Kaldjian before we bring him up here. He's the director of the program in Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Iowa Carver College of Medicine, where he's also the professor in the Department of Internal Medicine. He holds the Richard M. Kaplan Chair of Biomedical Ethics and Medical Humanities. He received his MD from the University of Michigan, an MDiv, and a PhD in Christian ethics from Yale University. He completed his residency and fellowship training at Yale in internal medicine and infectious diseases, and he's been here at the University of Iowa since the year 2000. His research interests have been directed toward end-of-life decision-making, goals of care, disclosure of medical errors, the role of foundational beliefs and values in medical ethics, practical wisdom in healthcare, conscientious practice, and ethics education. And a lot of these topics and these areas of interest of his are kind of interwoven into a book that he wrote. So if you're interested in reading more than Dr. Kaldjian has time to present on tonight, his book is called Practicing Medicine and Ethics, Integrating Wisdom, Conscience, and Goals of Care. So check that out if you're interested. Now, as impressive as that bio is, guys, the most impressive thing to me about Dr. Kaldjian, when Dr. Dodge and I had a chance to grab coffee with him, was number one, his authentic relationship with Jesus Christ. That just oozed out of him during our time together. But the second one is just an absolute zeal to live a life that honors God and to use the God-given gifts he has to help other people live a life that honors God. So it is an absolute privilege to have Dr. Kaldjian tonight. So why don't you join me in welcoming Dr. Kaldjian to stage tonight?
Thank you very much, Pastor Brian and Pastor Jeff, and all of you for being here tonight. It's a real privilege. As I say, when I get the wonderful opportunity of being with fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, is I get to speak in my natural native tongue, right? As opposed to the different languages that we all speak in different contexts of our various professional and working and neighborhood lives, etc. Pastor Brian and Pastor Jeff have been remarkably gracious and real brothers in Christ to welcome me into this opportunity. And I also want to mention the name of Caleb Eel. Caleb, you want to put your hand up? Let people see. Caleb's a medical student, and he and I have known each other for some years. And I think it's fair to say that Caleb was something of a matchmaker to help connect me to Pastor Jeff and Pastor Brian. So thank you, Caleb. So it's a real privilege to be able to be with you all today. I'm going to go ahead and ask if the first slide, James, could go up. That would be great. And I just, out of fairness and respect to the University of Iowa, I want to sincerely say, just to point out as a disclaimer, that my views here tonight do not represent the University of Iowa. So it's important because a lot of things that we're going to be talking about tonight are issues that strain and stress the public square, shall we say. And yet at the same time, we're all grateful, I trust, to be able to have opportunities to speak openly and to allow ourselves the freedom to have the kinds of conversations that we need to have. So tonight, we're talking about some really big and deep sort of terrain. And on the one hand, you'll notice that some of my slides are all too busy. I routinely disobey PowerPoint rules about what font and how many words and bullets and all that. But I hope also there will be a certain amount of conversational aspect that will make sense. You've got that little handout that has some sort of key topics on it as well. And for anyone who's particularly interested in more details, you can find my email online. Email me, and I'll be happy to send you a PDF version of the slides. So with that, let me go to this next slide here. So we're going back about 2,500 years to Plato, but it's a remarkable quotation. He says, "It would be better for me to have a musical instrument or a chorus which I was directing in discord and out of tune. Better that the mass of mankind should disagree with me and contradict me than that I, a single individual, should be out of harmony with myself and contradict myself." It's a remarkable quotation, right? And it's telling us something true from, someone who, to our knowledge, had not been exposed to the Hebraic tradition at that point in time. And yet this is an example, I think, of what we would refer to as God's common grace and his having given the conscience to the human being. And this human being, Plato, recognizing that. I'm particularly fond of the musical metaphor. And some of you might recognize Itzhak Perlman, that violinist. He was my violinistic hero growing up. I play the violin. And that's a picture from BYU, actually, their orchestra, while he's playing the Beethoven Violin Concerto. But for those of you, especially if you're into music, the idea of dissonance, I think you know what that means. And for some of us, when musical notes are conflicting with each other, it's really disturbing. We don't like that. So there's a sense, right, in which when moral notes or moral truths are conflicting, how disturbing that can be. Have you ever been in a place or been with other people where you have felt out of tune with the others around you? And then you think about what is it to then feel out of tune with yourself? And then from the Christian perspective, meaning God's imprint on you and his voice in you, and you're struggling to be in tune with that. So it's that sort of thing that we're talking about here today when we're talking about conscience. And actually, sorry, just before I do that, can I just see a show of hands? How many of you are in the health professions in one form or another, students or otherwise everybody? Okay, so lots. But if I had to eyeball it, maybe 2/3, 1/3 sort of thing. And that's great, because that's all that we're talking about here tonight is also relevant just for any human being. I mean, for those of you interacting with health professionals, it would seem to me that we all have an interest in knowing, in a sense, the reality of what we're talking about here tonight. So if I were to offer a list of the kinds of areas that are controversial, morally speaking, in our society. You can think of beginning of life issues, abortion, sterilization, contraception, IVF. Eugenic practices, you might not be as familiar with that. Some of you will know the history of eugenics in this country and other countries. But if you snoop around, you start reading about prenatal genetic screening, and you realize that that's basically a form of eugenics. Right? So it's happening in our society, even though people don't talk about it. And especially among genetic counselors, they don't want to use or hear the eugenics word because it's associated with Nazi Germany and others, et cetera, et cetera. Enhancement practices, physical or psychological. So what do I mean on the physical side? For instance, there's some literature out there on the use, say, of growth hormone for a child who is seen as being of short stature, but still within 2 standard deviations of the norm. And parents go to a pediatrician saying, we were hoping our son would be a quarterback someday, and his growth curve's not looking optimistic, so could you help things out? That's an enhancement, right? It's going above that child's normal for some advantage, some desired trait that the parents want. Or psychological. In the sense of, for all I know, there might be someone in this room who knows somebody who has decided, I think I'll be able to perform better on a test if I take a certain drug, right? This is happening in our society right now. So the idea of cognitive enhancing drugs is an issue. Circumcision. I know of one surgery resident that I learned about from my daughter she says she will not do a circumcision if she's asked to because she believes it's not right, it's not the right way to treat human beings of the male sort, right? So it's interesting how something that is as ancient a practice in certain cultures as that is objectionable to some people. And of course, you're familiar with concerns about gender dysphoria and surgical or hormonal treatments for that condition. That's well known and very topical right now. How about the notion of harm reduction and the fact that some harm reduction efforts that are aimed at making harmful or risky behaviors, such as intravenous or injection drug use, to make it safer through, say, a needle exchange program? Right? Some healthcare professionals are willing to participate in those possibilities. Others would say, no, we're actually participating in the wrong kind of activity, and abstinence and other approaches are the more appropriate. You're familiar with things like medically assisted suicide or euthanasia in the end-of-life care context. You may be less familiar with definitions of death, so-called brain death definitions versus the various ways to define a cardiovascular sort of death. And there is even some more contemporary variations on that theme. But you're probably not as familiar with why I'm parking that in this category. But for those of us who have spent more time learning about it, we appreciate the controversies involved. And then, especially for the health professionals in the room today, the idea of unnecessary, inappropriate, or futile treatments or tests. So the classic scenario would be in an intensive care unit where a patient is, as we say in medicine very unsophisticatedly, very sick and basically is dying, despite all sorts of attempts to try to keep a patient alive. The doctors and nurses, in their minds, there's no question, but that treatment to sustain the patient's life is not succeeding and therefore should be shifted toward keeping the patient comfortable. But the patient's family wants and is insisting on continuing to do everything possible to try to keep the patient alive. And the word that is sometimes used is futile or futility, very loaded word, and I often put it in quotation marks because you have to be careful about what you mean by it. But the point being is that there are some doctors and nurses who feel morally compromised if they have to try to keep someone alive who they think is basically better cared for and rightly cared for by keeping a patient comfortable and allowing them to die. So there's a lot there that one can talk about. I'm going to give you a few more examples to just sort of then bring us into this context, because I'm about to get into a lot of matters of philosophy and theology and public policy and whatnot. But I just wanted to start with a pretty heavy sort of quick dose of there's a fair amount out there that is or is potentially contentious. But what I also should say, and I want to say it, I'll say it now, I'm going to say this often to medical students, is sometimes people like me, we have various occupational hazards in medical ethics, right? We tend to sometimes focus so much on the problematic areas that we give the impression that the landscape is just completely bleak in healthcare. It's not, right? As I say to medical students, if you walk into our hospital right now, this very moment, and walk up and down the wards, you will not hear one argument after another coming out of each patient room, right? 95% of the time, 98% of the time, people agree about what appropriate care looks like. And I'm thankful for that, right? So I don't want to overstate it, but neither do I want to understate it for today's purposes. So an example that certainly happened to me in the work that I did for quite a few years as a primary care physician, opioids for chronic non-cancer related pain. A lot can be said about it, and depending on what doctor you're talking to about this matter, you will see a spread of physicians. Some will be more inclined toward the possibility of carefully using opioids for chronic pain. Others will basically say, no, the evidence isn't there for it, and no matter, even if my patient's yelling at me, insisting on that, I need to explain to them that I think it's going to cause you more harm than good, even though you say it's the only thing that makes you feel better, right? So again, that disagreement, and it becomes, for some doctors and other healthcare professionals, an ethical issue. How about communication? This actually happens. It happens also in our hospital. Sometimes a family member will come to the doctor and say, listen, it sounds to me like you're telling me that it looks like our mother has cancer. You just keep talking to us about that. We will decide when and if to use the word cancer in talking to our mom. That's in our family, and sometimes they might say in our culture, we are the ones who have that conversation, not the doctor, right? Some doctors I know are very uncomfortable with that, right? Because informed consent, patient autonomy, these things, they want to have direct contact, okay. And so that becomes a very challenging issue. Modafinil, you probably haven't heard that name, but some of you might be aware of it, but it's an alertness-enhancing drug. I once had a young woman as a patient, and she came to my clinic, and she had one request. She said, "Doctor, can you prescribe modafinil for me? I want to do more and sleep less." Sounds familiar to a lot of us, right? We kind of like that. But I had to explain to her that that wasn't my understanding of what health looks like, because she was completely healthy as far as I could tell. And that was a lifestyle preference, and it wasn't even FDA approved for that, et cetera. But she wasn't happy with my answer. I'll just leave it there. How about a patient who comes to a doctor and says, "Doc, I want to just make sure that I don't have cancer. Or if I do, I want it caught as early as possible. Please give me a whole body MRI scan." Right? There isn't an evidence base to support that. And so at the same time, there could be plenty of situations where some doctors can feel very pressured by patients, and they might even say, "Doc, I don't need insurance coverage for it. I have the money to pay for it. Order it for me, please." Or, "You better do it, or otherwise I'm going to file a complaint against the state medical board." I mean, that's the kind of thing that somebody might potentially do. And then this is one of the most common areas in our medical culture, the whole question of CPR, and we use this phrase code status. Are you a full code, or are you a do not resuscitate patient? It even sounds funny the way you heard me just say that, I know. But it's not uncommon at all in our hospital, where doctors and nurses are quite challenged by, sometimes very frustrated by requests and or demands by patients or family members to be full code when the doctors and nurses have concluded that the likelihood that resuscitative attempts like pressing on somebody's chest, using electricity to shock the heart, and also to put a tube into the windpipe to breathe for the patient, that those things would not be successful. And so there's tension about whether or not a doctor or a nurse would say, "Listen, if you ask me to be the one pressing on someone's chest, that would compromise my integrity," et cetera. All right. So I've given you a pretty heavy dose in those two slides of the kinds of things we're talking about. And now we're going to move on to this question of conscience. And I'm going to begin with a standard dictionary definition, which I actually think is quite good. A sense or consciousness of the moral goodness or blameworthiness of one's own conduct, intentions, or character, together with a feeling of obligation to do right or be good. So in that definition, you can see that conscience is a moral awareness, and it involves the ability to perceive morally, to self-judge, and a sense of moral obligation. Conscience is one of these big words. It's like justice, right? If you're having a conversation with somebody about justice, you better first take some time to define each other's terms and make sure you're on the same page, right? Conscience, I think, is also one of those big ideas, and I've had an opportunity to read a fair amount about it, and it's impressive how people have had different views about what conscience is for about 2,000 years. So it's not surprising that we would continue to have some different perspectives. But on the other hand, it still has a certain sort of currency, I think, in our culture where, on the one hand, you can still use the word without necessarily defining it. But speaking of history, the Greek sense of this was that it was a universal human experience of inner pain related to actions that go against human nature, right? So it was very much in the Greek culture. I won't go into it now, but it's interesting how the people have written thoughtfully about how the Apostle Paul uses the same Greek word for conscience in the New Testament. And it has about 35 or so instances, the word conscience in the Greek in the New Testament. But at the same time, conscience, at least according to one assessment, was that Paul used that term because members of some of the churches were using it. And so he had to use it to engage it when, especially in the correspondence about the weaker brother. And some people saying, well, my conscience is clear, so I'm okay before God, and therefore I'm going to do what I think is right. And then Paul, of course, prioritizes love over that notion of conscience. But in any case, it goes back to the Greek times. And then, speaking of the Bible, in the Old Testament, when the Old Testament writers used the word heart, basically you could exchange that for what I'm referring to as conscience, right, from a Christian perspective. Because the Hebrew didn't have, there isn't another word that gets translated the way we get conscience in the Greek. And you're familiar with, I'm sure, most of the people in this room with scriptures that refer to the heart in that sort of a sense. And then in the New Testament, this idea of a moral capacity endowed by God, I've given you some examples, and perhaps the most famous is that Romans 2:15. That is in contrast to Romans 1, when there's the darkness of the destructive impact of sin on the human heart that basically makes the human heart blind. Interestingly, how Paul in Romans 1 almost has that Hebraic sense of the heart being blind, right? So conscience being blinded. But then in Romans 2, that when pagans who don't know the law do by nature what is consistent with the law, that's that work of conscience. So it's certainly there in Scripture. This is a really interesting book, and I haven't read it, but I've read parts of it, all right? And especially the epilogue. Those epilogues, I think, are written for people like me who somehow think we don't have the time sometimes to read the whole thing. But I look forward to reading the whole book one day, don't get me wrong. Anyhow, Inventing the Individual. This book brought to my attention that prior to Christianity in the Western world, the social unit of value was not the individual. It was the family or the tribe, the group, but it was the family. But it's because of the Judeo, but specifically Christian influence on the Western world that now each human being, because of their relationship with God, is now co-equal in value and dignity. And conscience was in the core of that understanding. So this is the author is an Oxford intellectual historian, and he makes it really clear how the reason we have this conscience conversation in the West is because of the Christian influence on the West, right? And then what he also points out is that it created a role for conscience that set limits to the claims of any social organization, right? So when you think about, in our contemporary world, the state and the individual, and how you're familiar with, I'm sure, many examples of how people say, well, when the law is passed, you just have to obey the law, whatever that law is. And the state becomes actually godlike if God is no longer part of the equation. But conscience, from the Christian perspective, allowed, and I'm going to show a slide that brings us to Martin Luther toward the end, where Luther represented something remarkable in this regard, where in one moment when he was on trial, he was standing before the highest secular leader in the land and the highest religious leader in the land. And yet he, as an individual, by conscience, was resisting those powers. And that's what Christianity allowed to happen. So there's something, I think even non-Christians who have studied this history would acknowledge, that the value of the independent sort of power of moral agency of every individual that is actually really ingrained into Western and American society now, in terms of, say, the right to protest and an individual's voice, it comes from the Christian heritage. A wonderful statement about conscience, actually, I'm going to draw from the Catholic tradition, from the Vatican. And one document describes it this way: in the depths of his conscience, man detects a law which he does not impose upon himself, but which holds him to obedience, always summoning him to love good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks to his heart. Do this, shun that. For man has in his heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of man. According to it, he will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a man. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. It speaks for itself. So, talking there about a Christian understanding, here's a philosophical understanding that I actually find quite useful. In fact, Zachary, you want to raise your hand? Zachary's another medical student at Iowa, and he's been kind enough to take a certain elective that I've been teaching the last 4 weeks. And we were just talking about this. So here's the slide version, Zach, of these 3 points. And actually, if any of you are particularly fascinated by this question of conscience, the first item at the top there, this book by Douglas Langston, that's a really good read. It's a really, really, really helpful summary of almost a couple thousand years of sort of history. But the point I want to make here is that I find a very credible and broadly, I think, sort of agreed on understanding philosophically of conscience is to say that it's got 3 dimensions. And you see them there. It's got reason, emotion, and motivation. And one way that I quickly like to sort of tag that or to illustrate that is, have you ever had a guilty conscience? I won't ask for a show of hands because I already know what the right answer should be, because every hand should go up. All right, so we're all in this together. When you had a guilty conscience, did you not have an understanding? You could actually understand the reasons for why you felt guilty. All right, I trust that you did. It wasn't just, oh, it's like I have an abdominal pain. I don't understand what words are associated with it. I just know I don't like it. Right? It's not that. You understood why. There were reasons why. You also, as is already clear, you felt something. And in fact, I think some might say that the feeling of a guilty conscience might actually be the worst feeling you've ever experienced. In fact, some people point out that sometimes that feeling is so overwhelming, it leads some people to suicide, literally, right? And then motivation, that's a great sort of gift and grace of God, in that a guilty conscience is there to spur us on, to get us to go say to her, I'm sorry. Or to get on our knees and say to God, forgive me, have mercy on me, right? I mean, all the different ways in which we have to to reckon with our sinfulness. All right. So the particular emphasis that I like to make at this point, though, is to point something out. And I've come across this often enough in when reading, say, medical journal articles that touch on matters of conscience. It is my impression that if there's a writer or a speaker who disagrees with the position being taken by somebody who's saying this for me or for us is a matter of conscience, it is not uncommon, either directly or indirectly, to perceive that the one who doesn't like what that conscientious stance is representing, they will indicate that conscience thing, it's your private feeling. And why are you, what comes next, why are you imposing your private feelings on us? This is coming from philosophy, not from theology and the Bible. This reminds us that basically conscience is a rational capacity. It's more than that, but it's not less than that. It's a rational capacity. So it's really about ethics. And so that's one of the ways to quickly sort of engage that sort of a situation, is to remind somebody, hey, what we have here is an ethical disagreement. That's, in my experience, a much more acceptable form of engagement in our society than if somebody's saying, well, that's just your private feeling, as opposed to a public matter of ethics and policy, et cetera. So don't allow anybody to make you sort of just squirm into a corner and say, okay, I guess I'm not allowed to talk about my feelings. I know there's a certain irony. Somebody might be thinking, there are other discussions in our contemporary society where feelings seem to be taken quite seriously. I'm not necessarily I'm not going to go there right now, but you see the point here is it's part of reason, part of ethics. Okay. So here's a serious slide. And just by looking at that picture, you can probably quickly understand what this is about. Many of you will know the name Elie Wiesel, right? The Holocaust survivor, very famous Nobel Prize winner. This is an article that was published in the most famous medical journal in our English-speaking land, the New England Journal of Medicine. And it's about the Nazi doctors. And he writes, medicine was practiced in certain places not to heal, but to harm, not to fight off death, but to serve it. In the conflict between good and evil during the Second World War, the infamous Nazi doctors played a crucial role. How can we explain their betrayal? What made them forget or eclipse the Hippocratic Oath? What gagged their conscience? Or Apostle Paul might say, seared their conscience. Nazi doctors did their work without any crisis of conscience. They were convinced that by helping Hitler to realize his racial ambitions, they were contributing to the salvation of humanity. So I'm just struck by this example of conscience being, even in the title of the article, it's entitled Without Conscience, in the flagship medical journal of the English-speaking world, right? Written by a Nobel Prize winner. So conscience, as an idea, certainly has a certain staying endurance in our culture. This is from a survey that was done a few years back, but it basically asked over 1,000 doctors, where do you get your moral guidance in life? And you can quickly scan the right-hand side and you see the second to last one is the only one that's a large percentage, 92%. Personal sense of right and wrong. That, I think, is sort of a placeholder for conscience as well. So again, we're talking about something that I think we all can kind of agree on in a basic level. I'm going to try to pick up the pace here a little bit now, as I've never been very good friends with clocks and watches, right? All right, you get that. There's a paradox. This is a key point to make. And I think for some people, they find this a bit disturbing. For those of us who aren't afraid of paradoxes and tensions, it kind of reflects reality. Okay, so conscience on the one hand is authoritative. You've maybe heard the phrase, always follow your conscience. Always. It doesn't say only when it's right. It's always. But conscience might be wrong because you are fallible, I am fallible, therefore conscience is fallible. right? And so how is it that you can say on the one hand, always follow your conscience, but your conscience might be wrong? Why would you always follow something that may actually be misleading you? Well, the short answer is because it's the best you can do, right? And I'll come to that in the next slide. But I've given some scriptures here that actually speak directly to this question, right? So you know Jeremiah, the heart is deceitful above all things. 1 Corinthians 4:4, Apostle Paul, for I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It's the Lord who judges me, right? So our conscience is not the final judge at all. And then you see the 1 Timothy 4:2. There's a nice quotation here from John Frame where he says, conscience is not a norm to itself, over and above the law of God. It's a human means of learning and obeying the law itself. It's always wrong to disobey conscience, not because conscience is divine, but because to disobey conscience is to disobey what we think God is saying to us. So to deal with the problem of fallibility, and I'm borrowing the language of formed and informed from our Catholic brothers and sisters, they talk about the importance of a properly formed conscience. That's what all you parents are doing and did and have been doing, and we're all trying to help each other in that regard. And the church is so much a moral community doing that exact thing. And then we also need a properly informed conscience. So you can't make a good conscientious decision if you're ignorant of relevant facts and information, et cetera, right? And that's why part of wisdom is to take counsel with others, right? Is to seek out the understanding that I'm lacking, that you're lacking, et cetera. We need humility to deal with the problem of fallibility as well. And then you can see the details as I've listed them there. And I find a fascinating relationship between humility on the one hand and courage and confidence on the other. They do come together. So conscience is not infallible, and therefore it's not self-justified. But the conclusions of conscience are authoritative for an individual because they represent the individual's best moral judgments. That's why we should always follow our conscience. All right. I also want to quickly tag another word, integrity. I tend to use these words interchangeably. I'm not saying everybody or anybody has to agree with me on that. And it's not as if I've given you the shortest definition of integrity, but it's what I think. So I give it to you, okay? A moral virtue reflecting the harmony and constancy of individual moral character and identity by integrating and ordering valid moral beliefs, virtues, principles, words, and actions across time and place, empowering moral agency and motivating moral action. If you go onto hospital websites, routinely in the mission statement, you'll see the word integrity somewhere. I don't see a footnote that references this definition, but this is the kind of thing that I'm thinking when I'm thinking about integrity, and it's covering the same sort of domain and terrain as conscience. I want to just I'll just say very briefly, I have found it strange and to a certain degree sort of troubling that I sometimes read articles where people will make a distinction between, say, professional conscience versus individual conscience, or personal integrity versus clinician integrity. I think by definition, whatever the thing is we're talking about it's indivisible. It's because you're indivisible. Your moral identity, your moral agency, et cetera, okay? So I get what they're trying to do, but I disagree with that. So I would never allow oneself to be torn asunder, as it were. And on that note, in the lower part of the slide, the second item, dividing conscience leads to compartmentalization. That's borrowing that from Alistair MacIntyre, the famous philosopher. He talks about how dangerous and sad and self-destructive it is when a human being takes on one set of values in one social context and then has a different contradictory set of values in another social context, right? So you might have seen movies or read stories or maybe seen real-world examples of people who are, as MacIntyre would put it, they're like chameleons. They take on the color of the surrounding moral environment. And then you ask yourself, where's the moral integrity of that? And of course, it's lacking. So that's what we need to avoid, and that we need to be constant in that. In terms of connecting this all to ethics, in terms of major different theories of ethics, by talking about conscience, we're really solidly in the realm of moral agency and virtue ethics. So I won't say more about that now, but this is especially in contrast to utilitarian reasoning, the one on the far right, consequentialism. But even in a lot of us spend a lot of time in the deontological realm of principles there regarding matters of right and good and duty and whatnot. But as Oliver O'Donovan, I'm quoting him at the bottom here, he basically says that we in ethics generally in the West right now, we've basically lost sight of the moral agent. And we talk instead about outcomes and utilitarianism, or we talk about actions through the realm of duties, of obligation, principles, and whatnot. And so I find it very helpful to take a more virtue ethics-based approach that always reminds us that we as moral, it's not because ethics is about me, it's just to say that it includes me as a moral agent, and that should never get lost. So when I think about conscience, I think about, you can see I was kind of got the starry-eyed view there of the heavens, but it's the idea that there's sort of a constellation of different significant things that somehow swirl together as a network of relationships regarding conscience. And I also like to talk about foundational beliefs and values, which I will get to now, because this, I think, where push comes to shove when we have serious disagreements with other people in society at times. And so much of ethics, especially in healthcare ethics and the kind of places I inhabit and ethics committees and lecture halls and whatnot, we tend to hang out more in this mid-level zone of principles and some talk of virtue, but much more talk of principles. We don't talk as much about, hey, what's that based on? What are your foundations? In fact, I don't know if you've ever had those kind of conversations with somebody. It's kind of like some of us learn to start having these conversations when you have a child and that child gets to a certain age, like 5 or 6 or 7, and they get very good at using the single word question, why, right? You ask them or tell them to do something, they say, why? And then you answer it. And then they say again, why? And they keep, saying why until you say, because I'm the papa and it's time to go to bed, or something like that, right? You play the authority card, but you see what I'm getting at, is that why? And in one sense, that's what philosophy is about. It's asking why questions until you admit that you can't say more. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we all have our starting places. We don't start from nothing. You start, in fact, I remember reading one author who pointed out that the word dogma, in medieval times, dogma was a good word. It had a good connotation because it referred to the faith-inspired understanding that begins the process of reasoning, as opposed to I think it's actually an incoherent modern sense of you have to question. You start with skepticism, thanks to Descartes and company, right? But the point is, you don't actually start from nothing. Even any good scientist starts with a whole slew of important assumptions about discoverability and truth and logic and coherence, etc. There's a writer, a man who was named John Reeder at Brown University, and he wrote an essay called What is a Religious Ethic? And in that article, he basically says that in his sense of the use of the word religious there, it refers to our fundamental beliefs about what we believe is real and what we believe is good. And he points out the obvious, if you think about it, that everybody starts out with fundamental beliefs about what you think is real and what you think is good. So that's a helpful way, especially in certain conversations, if you think somebody who is not a religious believer is looking at you and saying, oh, your thoughts and positions don't get as much credit because you have to believe in God to take that position. But since we don't believe in God, somehow we are more privileged because we have more secular, publicly acceptable sort of beliefs. All you have to do is just keep asking enough questions and you realize, no, that means when's the last time, if you've ever done it, you should try it out. If you're having sort of a human rights discussion and you ask them, well, what do you think about human rights? Why do you think people have human rights? Oh, because the United Nations has a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Oh, I see, that's the best reason you have? Of course not. I mean, that doesn't, all it tells you is there's some entity decided to basically borrow from the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's what they've done, right? As opposed to, I think so many people become speechless relatively quickly. If you just ask a few why questions, you realize that they don't. And it's usually either someone who's really studied philosophy and thinks that they have a theory, although I confess, the philosophers, they don't have consensus on this. So that trajectory of reasoning hasn't successfully discovered the answer. And instead, what we have is a pluralistic environment, right? Where particularly religious faiths have a readiness to go directly to what they believe the foundations are. So these are the kinds of things, when I think about foundational beliefs and values, I'm thinking about human life, its value and dignity. Why? Persons, who's included? The unborn, the comatose, the brain dead, right? I mean, you can think about the extremes of what people consider normal. Human nature, its origin, purpose, destiny, embodiment, finitude, fallibility, conscience, even conscience. How seriously should it be taken? What's human freedom about? What is justice? What's a concept of health? What's the meaning of suffering, the meaning of death, the meaning of love and compassion? What's the good of the patient in healthcare? I find it particularly in our society when I think about the ethics discussions that I have, these three on the bottom capture most of the areas of contention, at least for the kind of work that I do. And it's, what do we mean by respect for life? What do we mean by a concept of health? And how much respect are we going to have for conscience, and how do we understand conscience? I think that captures a lot of what we're talking about. And when it comes to what it means to think about the patient's good, which is the context of the healthcare setting here, this is a very kind of a simple slide, but it's one that I use a lot because it's a goal-oriented, and it's consistent with the virtue of practical wisdom and the traditions that go back to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, where, in a sense, proper human action is always intentional. It's oriented towards some purpose, some goal. We all kind of take it for granted intuitively. But it's really important in healthcare because sometimes healthcare has a weird ability to kind of take on a life of its own, because it's kind of like we have something on the shelf, so we tend to just reflexively grab it and do it, as opposed to first decide, wait, what's the best goal we should be aiming at, and therefore what means is the best way to get to that end. And so what we often say in the abstract is, well, the goal, not the final goal of human flourishing, but in a sense, the direction is toward the patient's good. But what if we can't agree on that good? And here's an author named Edmund Pellegrino who talked about different aspects of the patient's good: the patient's medical good, their personal good, their human good, their spiritual good, right? So I gave an example, say, of opioids, narcotic analgesics for chronic non-cancer related pain. A patient, in their sense of personal good, says, doctor, the only way I can function is when I have that medicine. And then they might look at me and say, who are you to tell me that your sense of my human good, or the medical good, or if you're going to be really bold, my spiritual good? In a sense, how dare you? Isn't that the height of audacity, to think that your sense of my good should overpower my sense of my good? So we can talk about the patient's good, but if we're disagreeing about that good, we've got problems. Okay. So now, challenges in conscientious practice. I'll pick up the pace here now, and then I'll look forward to the Q&A. This is luxurious to have 2 hours here, and I assume this is part of the informed consent process, right? You all knew it was 2 hours. All right, so that's good. I won't overstay that welcome. But I did say, I said, I'll be done with the slide part within an hour. And I realize I've got like 5 minutes to pull that one off, and I think that's not going to happen. So give me another 15, 20 minutes. Is that okay, Brian? All right, great. Okay, so we need wisdom and courage to discern our moral responsibility and exercise our moral agency. So this is now, I'm very much speaking as a clinician among, other healthcare professional types. So for clinicians, we need wisdom to know about speaking up, whether, what, when, where, to whom. Now, having said what I just said, anybody in any line of work, right? There's immediate applications to life, not just to healthcare, but some of it's specifically about healthcare. Okay, what words and symbols to use or not use? I think you know what I'm talking about, especially an example would be the so-called pronoun situation right now. What to do? Tolerating evil versus cooperating with evil. I'll come to that later. Who to work with, who to work for. How to use and improve hospital policies or conscience protections. Which professional organizations to participate in, what committees to serve on, what leadership positions to accept, what public platforms to use, which advocacy organizations to support. I have a particular sensitivity to clinical trainees because of the hierarchies, especially in the healthcare world. The hierarchies are very real. So how to contribute to a classroom discussion, how to navigate rotation requirements on the clinical wards and opportunities, how to choose a specialty. Some specialties have more challenges than others in certain regards. How to choose a training program, how to speak with supervisors about morally objectionable practices. There are a lot of questions. I'm a big fan of just referring to the need to learn and learn more and more about what it is to give moral reasons. In short, one of my main concerns these days is that there's a lot of silence in our society. And I think a lot of Christians are often silent because, well, for a lot of reasons. Some more understandable than others. But I'm sure you've heard plenty of people, and I'm sure from this platform you've heard it said as well, how important to be salt and light it is that when God so desires, as to the best of our understanding, that we are ready to speak, right? And how we speak, of course, is really important. But the idea of giving moral reasons, what's the alternative? I think the basic alternative in our society is power. The brute imposition of power of stronger over weaker people. And so I think, sadly to say, one of the roles that Christians have in our society now is to actually give reasons, not just to say because, or just to declare and to yell your positions and yell louder if people disagree with you, right? To give reasons. And it doesn't mean people will accept our reasons, but it means that reasons are part of the gift of what God has given us. This is there's a lot in this slide, but it's actually, I think, for some of you, it's worth remembering this or remembering to go back to it. And I'm basically drawing from the Roman Catholic position here. They have this notion of the doctrine of cooperation, or the doctrine of not cooperating with evil, and not being morally complicit with evil. And they've really thought through what it's helpful to think through if you're wondering, should I be involved in X, Y, or Z? And this could even, I'll just give you a quick example. It could be, and you can find discussions of this sort of thing. Say if somebody who's a janitor works in a hospital, and they find out that the room that they've been cleaning for the last 3 months is a room that is used for abortions. That person, if she's a Roman Catholic, she might go to her priest and say, am I compromising myself? Is it acceptable for me to clean this room, or am I contributing? Am I being complicit with a moral evil? So that's the kind of situation. I've had a situation where a medical student was on a certain rotation. I won't go into the details, but the medical student had discerned that he could not even just be quietly present in the room, because to be in that room would be a quiet endorsement of what was going on. And he couldn't do that, so he now needed to talk to his clerkship director to explain that. And as matters of conscience, sometimes people, sometimes Christians, will also reach different conclusions about these different aspects of intention, proximity, seriousness, clarity, and impact. So I would encourage you actually to, at a later time, just sort of reflect on this and wonder about it, maybe read a bit more about it if you haven't already. I think a lot of it's pretty intuitive, but I think it's actually can be helpful. And especially where it can also be very useful is if someone comes to you asking for advice or counsel or allows you to be a sounding board. If you remember to just quickly look these variables up, it can actually help guide the conversation. And in that, I think that God is at work when we are earnestly seeking to do what is right before him. So when we are in circumstances where now we've concluded that there's a problem, there's a moral problem, there's an activity that we can't be a part of, you still have some questions to ask and answer. And so it will be a given that there's non-participation, right? So you're not going to directly participate or even indirectly, but then what do you do next? Do you stay quiet? And that's you can, because it has to be a circumstance, of course, where that's feasible. Or do you not participate, but now you also explain something to someone, whether it's your patient, whether it's your colleague, your supervisor, your administrator, somebody. How about if it's not participate, explain, and disclose information? So the standard example would be is, say, if a woman comes to a primary care doctor and says, I realize I'm pregnant and I'd like to have an abortion. And so the doctor could respond in various ways. But one way might be, well, here's a phone number to call for a clinic that provides that. See, just that action of providing a phone number, for some Christians, and I would actually hope all, but there may be some disagreements some people have, is that's already participating. You're participating in an intention. And we have to decide, whether that can be acceptable or not. And it will also depend, once again, on the thing itself, because there will be some things in healthcare that some doctors will say, no, I could see myself giving a phone number for some things, but not for other things. So that's that seriousness thing. That was one of the items on the prior slide. And then there's the issue of a referral. This is a very serious issue because in so many medical organizational statements about conscientious refusals, it's presumed that they want to say, okay, we're going to respect your right to not do it yourself, but you have to refer to somebody who will. So that action of referral now becomes the issue. So on referrals, basically the secular standard of care is that if there's a procedure that's desired by the patient within the clinician's specialization, supported by professional bodies, and it's legal, then the dissenting or refusing clinician has an obligation, a professional obligation or responsibility to make a referral to somebody else. All right? Whereas some of us disagree with that. And so this idea of a request referral to treatment is this arc of intentionality, right? So I'm contributing to the evil, the badness that I don't want to be a part of. And it's very much a utilitarian sort of idea that is basically saying, hey, it's just the outcome that matters. It doesn't matter if you've kind of contributed to it. You didn't do it in the end, and the patient's getting what they want, and that's the more important thing. This example on the bottom is a very real, sad and disturbing case that I had reasons to know a lot of details about, but it came from the province of Ontario, where Christian physicians and Christian medical organizations filed suit against the government because there was an effective referral, basically law in the province that said if your license will be at risk and presumably taken away if you are unwilling to make that referral. And they filed suit, lost the first case, appealed to the Ontario Supreme Court, and they lost that case as well. And in both cases, the justices said, you're right. this is a violation of your religious liberties, but the patient's access to care is more important than your religious freedom expression. It was just so sadly telling of where that culture is. I don't know if, and when I talk about Canada, I'm very fond of Canada. I actually have Canadian citizenship, but more importantly, my wife's a real Canadian. She actually lives in this country now for some years. I've never resided there, but so we're very fond of Canada, and all the more disappointed by just how secularized Canada has become. Because I know we have challenges in this country, in some jurisdictions more than others, but things have gone further down the railroad tracks in Canada than they have here in some very concerning ways, and that's one of them. So there's a need, just summarize a couple points here, to accommodate conscience. That word accommodation is a technically loaded sort of idea, so that if you or I have a conscientious objection or we're refusing something, there's a presumption, if reasonable and feasible, etc., that our employer, for instance, will accommodate our need, okay? And there's this thing called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, the legal policy people refer to it as. And a lot of fine print in there, but it's basically saying that, and this was actually President Clinton signed this back in the day at the federal level, and different states, some states also have state-level RFRA statutes. But it basically says that the government may substantially burden the free exercise of religion of a person or organization only if the government has a compelling interest and uses the least restrictive means possible. So you might be thinking, why did I shift over to religious freedom? I think there's a lot of overlap between conscience and conscientious practice and religious freedom, because especially for those of us whose consciences are guided by religious faith, there's a direct connection. But that's a nice thing to know about if you're ever sort of wondering about what you might be stepping into. And it's all the more, reason why it's really important related to this, that I think one of the areas where we need to keep engaging our colleagues in our society, in our communities, and our legislators is to keep pointing out which practices are controversial. Because the moment the system says, well, that's not a controversial area, then in a sense, we will be disenfranchised on that matter. But if we can keep alive the question of, oh, that's one of those controversial things, like abortion, right? No one in our society disagrees, I think, with the descriptive observation that that's a controversial matter. Whereas they might want to say other things that I would want to call controversial, they might not want to call controversial. All right. Here's an example of an actual, and I'm not going to tell you what hospital this is from, but this is from an actual hospital that says in its policy about conscience and accommodation, it says, staff have the right to refrain from participating in care or treatment that conflicts with the staff member's religious, cultural, or ethical beliefs. But it's the responsibility of the staff member to advise the institution at the time of employment or as soon as the potential conflict is identified of religious or ethical constraints that may impact performance or the staff member's ability to meet job expectations, etc. Immediate supervisors will discuss restrictions with staff member and determine if there are accommodations that can be made. If an employee is faced with an immediate conflict, the supervisor should be notified immediately. Care to the patient must be provided until other arrangements can be made. At no time should the care of any patient be compromised because a caregiver refuses to provide or participate in needed care. So one take home from this slide would be to say that for any of you who are actually in healthcare environments right now, if you've never snooped around to find out, what is my organization's policy on this? I'd encourage you to do so. Find out and be informed and be as proactive as you need to be. So I acknowledge in all this kind of discussion that there's a tension between the professional's right of conscience and the patient's so-called right to access legal services. This is a law review article written by a law professor. Basically makes the point that in most cases, we can work this out, right? And that's why, in fact, even in the Ontario context that I just was referring to, I'll bet you if the society, if the leaders in those courts had wanted to, they could have come up with a way to say, you know what? You need a 1-800 number and just have signage all over the place. If your doctor has a conscientious objection to something, call this number. We'll find you a doctor who will take care of it. That's a fix, right? And apparently some other countries do some things kind of like that. And so to me, it's often sort of representative of a lack of desire to do that sort of thing that keeps it from happening. This is just, I won't dwell on this except to say that some people raise the question of symmetry. Say, okay, if Kaldjian has the right to not participate in something he thinks is immoral, then why doesn't Dr. Jones have the right to do something in his hospital that his hospital thinks is immoral, but he thinks is moral? So if I have the right to not do something, why doesn't Dr. Jones have the right to do something? So you might think, well, come on, give me a real world context. Think about a Catholic hospital. There was actually a case in Colorado where somebody who was employed and should not have done this by the laws of that hospital, she decided, because it was legal in Colorado to practice physician-assisted suicide, she did. And the hospital fired her because that's inconsistent with Catholic healthcare. Some people think, no, that doctor who was fired, she should have the right to do what she thinks is for the good of the patient. Sadly and tragically, to end that patient's life. I think a good argument can be made to say that there is an asymmetry here, right? So when I say that I'm not going to do something, I'm not getting in the way of the institution's continuation of doing that. Whereas if I insist on going in the opposite direction, in a sense, I'm detracting from the institution's mission. And so there's sometimes people will talk about institutional conscience. And I'm a big fan of supporting, say, that we need, I don't know if you know this phrase, the mediating institutions of society, that the real statists in our world, they want government and individual and nothing in between, right? You know about those discussions, I expect. Whereas a healthy society has all sorts of mediating institutions, family, church, the Rotary Club, you name it, all these different institutions. So it's important to allow a faith-based healthcare institution to have its conscience because the members who are driving the mission have that. All right, I'm going to finish up rapidly now. This will be familiar sort of terrain. So once again, our good friend Plato and music, right? And this idea of self-harmony. I think it's a maybe I'm just too into music, but I find that it warms my heart to think that way. And here's our friend Martin Luther, right? Who's, when he's being interrogated and asked, do you or do you not repudiate your books and the errors they contain? And he says, unless I am convicted by scripture and plain reason, my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and I will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. God help me. Amen. And apparently the earliest printed version added that famous line, here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. So it's a great, great moment in history there. I don't know if you know the name Ole Hallesby. I use his devotional. I highly recommend it, even though it's about 100 years old. It still seems like, for me, it was written today. He also wrote a book on prayer that might be his best-known book in certain evangelical circles. But he also has a little book on conscience, and he says, a good conscience brings a worthwhileness to a person's whole life, gives it a wealth and fullness and a quiet, peaceful joy. And you know Psalm 119, and you know 1 Corinthians 13:6, but I don't know how often you've reflected on or dwelled on that love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Right? It's that taking joy in and delighting in. And Psalm 119 is remarkable in that regard. And even speaking of music, your statutes have been my songs. To think that when we are in tune with God's law and his way, in our obedience, that it's as if, when I hold my violin and when things are going as they should, you can feel the violin literally resonating in a certain way, right? So there's this sense in which we resonate. We were made to resonate in certain wavelengths. And when those aren't there, it's not good. Okay, so kind of a busy roadmap slide, but it's to say that this is my way of sort of graphing out what happens when we want to approach what we do with integrity. And when we encounter stressful or even morally distressful situations, we need to engage with communication, right, at a certain level when we're with other human beings. And things don't go well if we don't take the right pathway, and we can lead to things like moral injury and burnout. But if things go well, then we're conscientiously practicing, right? And I mean, it's easy to put a PowerPoint slide together, right? Life is so neat and tidy. Just follow the yellow brick road and you get to where you need to go. No, in actual case, I'm sure some of you have had these situations where you're thinking, oh, I am just dreading having to have that conversation. It's hard work to engage. And yet, isn't it God's promise to us that He will be with us, and as the scripture says, even give us the words to say, even if we're not brought before rulers, even if we're just brought before our boss, that's enough of a challenge. Okay. Conscience also helps sustain democracy. So apparently our American founders recognized the interdependence between virtue, democracy, liberty, religion, and conscience. And in order for virtue to develop in people, there must be liberty, especially freedom of religion and conscience. Conscience was very much a playing card in what became that First Amendment, but they chose the religious language rather than the conscience language. And then Madison clearly understood that if men are not loyal to their duty to their God and their conscience, it's folly to expect them to be loyal to mere legal rules, statutes, judicial orders, and professional duties. If you demand that a man betray his conscience, you have eliminated the only moral basis for his fidelity to the rule of law and have destroyed the moral foundation of democracy. So it's that important. How many of you have heard of ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom? Those of you who haven't, I'd encourage you to just check them out online. They do some remarkably important work in our society. And it's because a lot of people donate funds to them. And they're the folks who are often up in the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, litigating cases, and they do this it's all pro bono. So it's a key message here is if any of you as healthcare professionals are ever in a situation where you are basically being discriminated against unfairly, literally call up Alliance Defending Freedom. And if it's appropriate, they will represent you. Another resource comes from the Christian Medical and Dental Associations, CMDA. And they have a healthcare right of conscience position statement. It's about 6 or 7 pages. So it's a nice resource you can just quickly get to online through your smartphone anytime you want to get a refresher on what you want to think about. Last slide here. So in summary, conscientious practice reflects a serious moral conviction involving moral obligation, our identity. It needs respect from others, but it also should have an expectation of explanation to others. That's that rational component, that reason-based component. And conscience and integrity should be understood as a fundamental part of our lives as moral persons, engaged as part of ethical reasoning, respected as a right in a morally pluralistic democracy, and supported for the flourishing of health professionals, patients, and society. And with that, thank you for being so patient and listening.